Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Winning Momentum podcast. I am Scott Sinclair, your host, and today we are exploring a dramatic story of an epic family struggle for control of a business empire. Hopefully, we draw lessons and themes from a saga that's worthy of the popular HBO series Succession. And to do that, my guest today is the author of this new book, Stephen Kimber. The book is The Phelan Feud. And if you are on the video version of this podcast, you will see the cover. It's Phelan, Phelan Feud, released this month being June 2024. And Stephen, I want to say it's available everywhere, but it was sold out. So I actually had to go to your publisher and get a copy. How are we doing today for availability?
As far as I know, it's back on the shelf. So I think it should be possible to get online or in your local bookstore by ordering it, for sure.
Perfect. So a bit about Stephen's background for context. Stephen is an award-winning Canadian writer, journalist, professor, known for compelling storytelling and in-depth investigative reporting. And I will tell you, listeners, that this book is extraordinarily in-depth. I want to talk to you about that, Stephen. He has a career spanning over 5 decades and has authored 10 books, including fiction and nonfiction books. There's lots of notable books in there, but one of them is What Lies Across the Water, the real story of the Cuban Five, which was long listed on the Canadian Booksellers Association Libris Award. Am I pronouncing that properly?
I think so. Yes, I think
there you go. Stephen's expertise extends beyond writing. He's a professor in the School of Journalism at the University of King's College there in Halifax, where he is right now, I think, and a co-founder of the King's Master of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction program.
You got it all.
Did I get it all? That was my next question. All right. And some context on the book for everybody. The quote on the cover of the book says that this is a story, a cautionary tale for any family business and an absorbing read for anyone looking to observe a real-life Succession, as I said, the popular HBO series, on power struggles. And it looks into a complex and contentious succession battle within one of Canada's wealthiest families, the Phelans, who were the owners of Cara Operations, and its well-known restaurant chains like Swiss Chalet and Harvey's, which was one of Canada's largest food service companies, rivaling McDonald's and Tim Hortons. And it was thrown into, we'll get more into this, but thrown into turmoil when its patriarch, Paul James Phelan, refused to yield control despite pressure from the 4 kids. And it talks about, this is going to be my first question when I finally get there, Steve. And it talks about the battle between the sexes of the children, about the daughters, Gail and Rose, who band together to fight their brother, ultimately for control of the company. Now, I do want to say before we start, Stephen, that you had a blurb in the Globe Mail about this book, and I was excited, and I contacted you from that. And again, for my American listeners, the Globe Mail is like, I've told you this before, it's like the Canadian Wall Street Journal. We're in the report on business section. And one of the reasons I was so interested, well, a couple of reasons. One is that I love historical business stories and lessons that we can take from that. But also, as a good Torontonian of that age, I grew up on Swiss Chalet and Harvey's. And I mean, literally grew up on Swiss Chalet and Harvey's. And I travel a lot. And so Cara Foods is in all the airports, in all the airports, and on, I think they had 60% at one point of all meals in the sky, which is just crazy. So that's what I expected, and that's one of the reasons I was interested in this book, Stephen. But what I got as a bonus, which I wasn't expecting, is a book full of Toronto society life and stories that I really enjoyed. Stories about Upper Canada College and Bishop Strums, so UCC and BSS, the private, very ultra-private grade schools from the neighborhood that I lived in once upon a time. Life in Forest Hill, that very upscale neighborhood that we're talking about. Private clubs like the York Club. I'm not a member there, but I'm a member in a rival club. Sailing at the Royal Canadian Yacht Club, and that society, that piece of Toronto society, and horse breeding and and racing. Loans to the notorious Harold Ballard to buy the Maple Leafs. I mean, this is all good stuff if you're a Torontonian, and I know that half my audience, in fact, are Torontonians and probably professionals And so you guys and gals, you would love that part of the book for sure, on top of anything else. I found that very interesting and entertaining. So, with all of that background, Stephen, why don't we jump into what inspired you to write this book? I noticed when I did some research on you, you're not really a business writer. You're more, your articles and your books are more about just society in general, governance and justice, not really business focused, if I can put it that way.
Mhm.
But clearly you found this business story to have some universal themes or conflict that would be interesting and worth investigating. How did you get into this? What was the process, and what inspired you?
Well, I should say off the top that it may not seem like it, and I hope it doesn't read like it, but it is in fact a commissioned book, commissioned by Rose and Gail. Um, and I got into it mostly by accident because I had written a book called Bitcoin Widow, which with the woman who was the wife of the fraudster of Quadriga, which was a big Bitcoin firm back in the earlier 2000s. And he had died while they were on their honeymoon in India. And uh, people thought he hadn't died, that he actually made off with the money and was on some beach somewhere, and that she was in on it, and a whole bunch of other things. So
Right.
she came to me, and I wrote the book in her voice. That book was published, and around the time, in fact, well, sort of going back to the Globe and Mail, and in this case, the Globe and Mail and the Walrus both published excerpts from that book at the same time that Gail and Rose were looking at hiring somebody to help tell the story of the family business. And so my agent, asked me if I was interested, and there were other writers as well who were interested in the story, and I was very happy to be chosen. I didn't think at the time that there was going to be anything nearly as dramatic, as Succession like as it
Right.
turned out to be, but it did turn out to be that, and so it became, although it's, as I said, it's commissioned, but it I think it revealed a lot about the family and the business and the business practices of the family. I think it's that kind of book. I know everybody asked me, what are the lessons to be drawn from this, and I'm not sure. I think there's one lesson, which is don't do what they did. Right, that's the best lesson that could be drawn from the book
Don't
itself.
don't do what the kids did, or don't do what the patriarch did.
Well, I'll start with the patriarch. I mean, I think that he is responsible for it. This is Paul James Phelan.
Yeah.
He's a third generation entrepreneur, and he had some amazing successes. First of all, he inherited a business that was pretty disparate. When you mentioned Cara Operations, people in Canada will know of it more from being on planes and being in airports where Cara had the concessions for those things. And but that's not nothing like Swiss Chalet or Harvey's, in the sense that it's not a public
Yeah.
kind of company. It's much quieter than that. But he inherited the Cara Operations side just as the railway business was falling apart, which was their original. I mean, if you want to go back, and just very briefly, just to tell you the story of Cara, it goes back to, I think, it's 1883. Started with a couple of brothers and cousins selling apples from an orchard, from their local orchard, and newspapers to passengers on steamboats going to see Niagara Falls. And they turned that into a business that was right across the country, operated on the basis of the railroads. And they, if you went to a newsstand in Halifax or Vancouver, they operated the newsstand. You wouldn't know that they operated the newsstand, but they did. They started doing restaurants and other things, and it became a very serious business. But by the time that Paul James inherited that, the rail business was in steep decline in terms of its importance. They had the airline business, which they got during World War II because they had the railway business, and the government decided that it was better to just give them that business rather than to open it up for bidding. So they didn't have that. But it was a very much a crossroads. And the problem with the airline business side of things was that all it took was the signature of the Minister of Transport, and they would have lost 90% of their business. It would have just disappeared if they'd given it to somebody else at some point. So he was looking to diversify and found this small but growing fast food chain that operated Harvey's and Swiss Chalet and bought those. And I mean, that transformed the company in a certain sense from back room kind of operation in terms of the food industry to a very much front facing. You said you grew up on it. I know that I used to take the family to birthdays and anniversaries and all of those sorts of things. We would go to Swiss Chalet and have the very familiar half chicken with a
Yep.
a bread roll and it was it was very good for the price, and Harvey's was the same.
Yep.
And so he did that. That was his great accomplishment, Paul James. But what happened after that is he did what you're supposed to do. I think probably in the by the time of the third generation, instead of being the operating guy at the company, you want to be above that. So you hire professional managers, and he did that. And the problem for him was that he really didn't know what to do after that. He was no longer central to the way the company operated. And so he would, as his daughters and others explained to me, he sat in his office in the afternoons and read sailing magazines, or he'd go to his club and drink
Yeah.
and go
Yeah.
sailing. So he did a lot of those
We're
kind of things. Yeah,
we're going to come back to that point, and
sure.
I
Yeah.
promise I won't harass you too much on lessons learned. In fact, I'll give you what I think some lessons are, and you can comment on those
Sure.
if that's more helpful to you. But with this book being commissioned, you said by Gail and Rose, and I knew that you had documents from them and tremendous cooperation, and I was trying to read as diligently as I could in the week that I had to prepare through the book. But I missed the commission part. But why? Like, what are they hoping to get out of the telling of their story?
I think what happened, they did not watch Succession, which my initial feeling was they had seen Succession and thought that this would make a good story, which it absolutely does. But from their point of view, they'd gone through 20 years of trauma over their own succession, that had split the family and all of those things, and had been told a lot of times by their friends that this was a story that needed to be told, but they really didn't want to. They weren't comfortable with it. And then, if you remember the Rogers family in Canada, which was Rogers Communications, they had a huge blowout between the brother and his sisters and the mother. And in that,
And just for the
Sure.
listeners, Rogers dominates cable and wireless in Canada to this day. I mean, dominates, and so it's a big deal. Sorry, just carry on.
No, that's perfectly fine. It definitely is a big deal, and it's the kind of big deal that became a big story when there was a fight between the brother and the sisters, and the pioneer in that particular sense was already dead, but it was his legacy that they were really talking about. And in that particular boardroom battle, the brother won. The sisters and the mother were squeezed out. And so Rose and Gail, I think, looked at that and said, here's a situation where similar things happen, but we won. I mean, the women won in this case. And that was a story then worth telling.
So that leads into what was going to be my next major section here, or question, which is the male versus female in the next generation and the family dynamics and the conflict. And so, for background for everybody, you have the patriarch, Paul James Phelan, and he has 4 kids, 3 daughters and a son, correct? And 2 of those daughters have kind of checked out of the picture. They're off doing other things. And you've got Gail, who's working in the business and has changed her life in the sense of gone back to school while also being a mother and prepared herself to take over the business. And you've got a son who in the early part of this drama doesn't seem to really care, and certainly is not being perceived by his siblings as being competent to step into this situation. And I think that all changes, not the competency, but the caring part changes later in the book, and I'm not saying he's competent or not competent. It seems clear that Gail feels like he's not competent, and so you start off the book with this big meeting in 1988 in Forest Hill, and you've got the family members there and some lawyers from Fraser Beatty and other lawyers, and there's David Bork fellow, a consultant, an American, and specializes in family businesses and succession. He's trying to guide the family through these things, and they're talking about a change in the will. And the change is that rather than taking the control block, the controlling shares of this company, and dividing it up among the 4 children, we're going to skip this generation entirely, put it into a voting trust, and the voting trust will have one member of the family on it being the son, none of the daughters, and then 2, executives or non-family members. And the beneficial interest of that trust, the value goes to what would then be the grandchildren when they come. Right. That's my understanding of reading through the book. And what made that possible was that Paul James's wife, so Gail's mother, comes from another fabulously successful and wealthy family in Toronto, the Gardner family, who had Scott's Hospitality, which is Kentucky Fried Chicken and a stock brokerage firm and different things. And so the kids were already super rich from that inheritance. Yeah. And Paul says, well, you don't need this money. It'll be for the grandkids. And if we do it this way, it's going to ensure management continuity. It has tax efficiencies because this was proposed by Cooper Lybrand, and it sidesteps some of these family power structure. That's the way we're going to do about it. To which Gail says, well, wait a minute, only Paul seems to be on this voting thing, and we don't trust him in the sense of his competency and his cares. And also, by the way, my father's just a terrible alcoholic right now, and he's not paying attention to the business. And so I got all sorts of problems, and he's off trying to, be in America's Cup, Canada's submission or entry to the America's Cup sailing race. And so she wants to bring this to a head for all of these reasons. And so you start the chapter or the prologue even with a quote from David Bork's book, which says, in the American business tradition, taking a woman into a company was on par with taking a woman to sea. Bad luck. So my question with all that is when Gail and Rose came to you, like, clearly that's what's driving them. It's clearly this. It was so important to them, and therefore to you, to really start the book with this this idea that the controller was supposed to go to the son, whereas clearly the one who cared and was competent was the daughter. And well, I'm not even that was a large part of the conflict. Was that correct? And what are your thoughts on that?
It is correct at one level. I mean, and I think if you go back to the background that you were describing, Paul James was an interesting character because he, in theory and in his heart, believed in family and family business and family succession, and he wanted the kids to all get along, and that was sort of part of the original will and his thinking toward the second part. But he, for some reason, he didn't seem to trust his son. Now that there were all sorts of possibilities there. They were never articulated. Yeah. And they, as you said, the mother and father encouraged the daughter Gail to go back to school. After she had gotten her PhD and was teaching and had a growing family of her own, and they encouraged her to go back and get her MBA so that she could come and join the business. But then when she came and joined the business, they had nothing for her to do, right? So she was in charge of the 100th anniversary celebrations, but that was the extent of it. And she wasn't comfortable.
And this David Bork guy just like made up a job title for her that was completely meaningless, and a job description for her that was completely meaningless and clearly offended her.
Yeah. Well,
the chairman of this holding company.
Right? Yes. I mean, I think that, and I don't know, Gail is an interesting person. They're all interesting in very complicated, different ways. I mean, Gail was diagnosed later in life as on the autistic spectrum. And you can see that in terms of when I interviewed her. She's very blunt. She's outspoken in all sorts of ways. She doesn't think before she talks, so she creates some interpersonal problems on her own way. But so you had that whole situation, and as you said, Paul David was diffident about the company and whether he wanted to be involved. He was much more interested in commodity trading and computers and sailing than he was in the business.
Yeah.
So, Rose will tell you that she doesn't necessarily believe that Gail was the best person to run the business, but she also didn't believe that Paul David was. And so she was worried about Paul David for a variety of reasons. What had happened, if you go back in the book and you see his growing up and you talked about the society for which he came in Rosedale and all that stuff. I mean, he was a privileged son who enjoyed the privilege, and so he, on the one hand, was a good guy, jolly, happy, well-met sort of individual at first. But as time went on and as the relationship with Gail deteriorated, and it deteriorated for a number of reasons. One of the things I said about Gail's autism and on the spectrum, and she describes this herself, that Paul David had a daughter, their second child, was diagnosed with leukemia, and it was touch and go for a long time, and it was clear to Gail that she wasn't going to make it. And so Gail at one point tries to offer her empathy to Paul, but at the same time says, well, if she doesn't make it, and that sort of caused Paul David to blow up. And, I don't think from what I can gather, he probably never forgave her for that. And so that made this more and more personal, as well as business related. And Paul David was not a businessman.
And everybody had a huge sense of entitlement.
Oh, yes, everybody did.
That's what I take mostly from the book, because you say, well, Rose didn't think Gail was the right person, but she also didn't think, Paul, is that?
Paul David, yes.
The son. Paul Jr. That he wasn't the right person either. And what really goes through my mind is, why does she even think that that's any of her business? Like, it's not her business. It's up to the patriarch at this point to have a plan and stick to a plan, and the sense of entitlement that everybody should participate in this and fight with each other and go against the wishes of the guy who built the business from what he inherited. It's confusing to me, but the only answer I can come up with, you can confirm this or not, is that the patriarch created that environment. He led them to believe that was the case.
I mean, I think that he wanted it to be and continue to be a family business. It's the role of the person who built the business to sort of see it going forward. But the problem was he could never get past himself. He could never get past who should rule. He didn't choose anybody. He didn't allow that process to play out. And so he created a situation where the children were feuding. I think that the sense, I think you have to remember that there's sort of the business side of it, but there's also the wealth side of it. And so there was Cara Operations and Cara Holdings. Cara Holdings was the company that held the family investment and the family riches. And they were all directors of that. So they had a role to play, and I think it was a legitimate role to play. But the other problem with Paul James, was that he treated that as kind of his private piggy bank. So a lot of the investment that he put to the sailing came from their collective assets, their wealth going forward. So and he also invested in a property that became sort of the family compound in Collingwood near Toronto, right on a ski resort hill. But by doing that, he again used money that really belonged to Cara Holdings to buy these things. And then later, when the mother comes in and says to Rose, the youngest child, I want you to have these 10 acres with this farmhouse on it that is part of the property. And then they suddenly discovered that, no, you can't do that because it actually belongs to the company, right? You can't give it away in the way that you wanted to. So, yeah, there were all sorts of
one of my first lessons, just leaving that section of our discussion here, is that you have to, I don't know how you fight the entitlement. Like I have a young daughter right now. She's 11. That's my only child. And, we have some wealth, not that wealth, but some wealth. And, I think about that a lot. And I don't know how you get around the entitlement thing, but on this family business issue, I think the lesson here is you need to focus on the business separately from the family. And the business needs what the business needs for leadership. And the family needs what the family needs for wealth, as you described. Those are two different things. And the right answer for the leadership may not come from the family. It might, but it may not.
Right.
And it's up to the current leader, patriarch or otherwise, to have that plan and make that decision and execute on it. And I don't think you can have all these fingers in the pie, so to speak. You're just never going to have a solution. And I want to keep this not too long, but one of my questions I was going to ask you, if we could just pass on this for now, or maybe do it really quickly, is the role of the consultants and the professionals in this. Because as I'm reading between the lines of your book, I'm just seeing the billable hours go up, and everybody have the competing advice, and nothing ever getting done. And
I think that's true. Although if you look at it, and not just the family business consultant, but lawyers made millions in the process of this fight over succession. I mean, everybody had a lawyer.
Exactly.
The companies had lawyers. The companies' directors had lawyers. So much of that going on, and so much money going out. The family business consulting operation, this is relatively new to me. And researching that was interesting. I mean, I don't think that Bork was wrong. I mean, he had some good suggestions for them, but they never really listened to him. I mean,
but that's the problem. Right? Like the suggestions are right because they're not brain surgery. They already know the answers. What they're not doing is executing on those answers. And so my whole career in mergers and acquisitions, dating back to the early 90s, I've been told in seminars and in our training sessions that there's a coming boom in the M&A world driven by demographics and succession, right? The business owners are getting older, going to sell, and their family members don't want to take over. And when I'm listening to this, what I was thinking to myself, really, even back in the early 90s as a young professional, was there's two fundamental flaws with that theory. And the first flaw is that we can't all be sellers. There have to be some buyers and for a transaction to happen. And I think mathematically that's turned out to be more or less true. But more importantly is the patriarch never, ever finds the right time to step away and to sell or to transition to a family member because it's difficult. It's difficult to walk away from the piggy bank. It's difficult to walk away from all the perks and the ego boost and being the man that having a successful business offers. You just always think, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. And then you can't do it anymore because time flies and you end up in trouble. And so I always thought, well, we're not going to have an M&A boom. We're going to have a troubled company boom. That's what we're going to have. And that really hasn't worked either for other reasons, but we definitely did not get the M&A boom from succession and from outright sales. I once had a client, mid-90s, I think, in Southwestern Ontario, an auto parts manufacturer. And I was put in there by the bank, recommended, hey, can you go help these people? And family-owned business, and the patriarch had not transferred it to his son yet, and he was still hanging on, same story. And he was 81 years old, He had a 18-month-year-old. He had terminal cancer, and he was still going, and the business was just going off the cliff. But it was just intellectually, he knew it was the right thing to do, but he could never bring himself to pull the trigger today. It was always tomorrow's problem. And I got a lot of that from this book.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the PJ, Paul James, you're right. He knew the right thing to do. No, but then, he didn't know which of the children that he wanted to give it to, but he knew that he wanted to keep it in the family, and he wanted to keep control in the family. And what you had still is professional managers. So all the time that this was going on, Cara didn't suffer as an operating company particularly. I mean, they were not they were successful. They continued to be successful through all of this. Some mistakes that they made, but nonetheless, they were successful. But it was inside the family that was causing all the problems and all the grief. And it was because, you're right, he couldn't pull the trigger. He didn't know what the right decision was, I think. And he also didn't want to have to make that decision between his son and his daughter, even though he set it up. I mean, it would have been much easier for him if he had, I suppose, really believed in his son as the successor and stuck to his guns on that. Gail had her own career at that point and probably would have been happy to be connected to the wealth side of the family without having to be in the middle of the decision-making process.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Did you get a sense that she even cared about running the business for the sake of running the business, or would they all just have been happy to sell it to Fairfax way earlier?
No, I think in truth they would not have been happy to do that. I think Gail in particular, because she had an MBA, and I think when I said that Rose didn't necessarily think she was the best person to run it, I think Rose's view was that Gail was a very bright person, much more academically inclined and interested in theory as opposed to the practicalities of running the business.
Right.
And so, but Gail, in that sense, was very interested in the business, and she would get into fights with people on the director side and on the management side. She was much more hands-on in many ways than Paul David. So she did want that. But it's there's no easy answer to these things. I think that it became a spiral, and there's no question that, as David Bork said, and as you see in the book, they had serious family issues with alcohol and addictions and other things that interfered with their ability to make those decisions and to carry through on them.
Gail was what generation? 3 or 4?
3. 4. 3. Sorry, yes. The fourth generation was Paul David, Gail, Rose, and the sister Sharon, who wasn't really involved.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, sort of the premise for all of my content is that 90% of all businesses fail. And of every business that starts this year, 90% of them will never, ever, ever pay their founder a living wage. That's the definition I'm using for failure. And out of the 10% that do, only 20% of those create intergenerational wealth. In other words, the entrepreneur can sell their business, have enough cash to pay off the mortgage and send the kids to school. So 2% of new businesses do that. And then and the whole point of my content is maybe we can help entrepreneurs be educated a little bit more on the fundamentals of business and some strategies to gain momentum, which is why it's called the Winning Momentum Podcast. And maybe we can improve those statistics. And your book talks about statistics in the of family-owned businesses, that there's 80% of all businesses in the country, the family-owned businesses are 80% of all businesses in the country, and 30% of those survive the second generation and 10% past the third. And I would suggest to you that those 30% of the second generation and 10% past the third are of the 2% that even had a chance to get to the second generation, right? So you're getting to some really, really low numbers. one of the first files in my career in restructuring and turnarounds was Imperial Optical, the Vermont family.
Hmm.
And Imperial Optical back in the day was in front of the Competition Tribunal in Canada for controlling vertically integrated over 80% of the Canadian optical market. And their third generation was it was a long time ago, but the real estate company was Pageant, PAJA. So it was Peter, Andrew, John, and Adam were the four sons.
Hmm.
And they were taking over the business. And I forget which one of them was running the optical side of the business, but I will tell you when we went in as the receiver, I was with KPMG back then, that his voicemail said, I think it was, anyways, it's whoever, Vermont. I'm not in right now. I'm probably off doing something much more interesting. That was his voicemail. And so, we had a sense of that here from, I think, Paul Jr. And that's why I asked you if Gail and Rose even really cared about the business itself rather than the wealth, but it sounds like clearly at least Gail did.
I think that she cared about the business. She also cared about the wealth. And I think that, in the sense that they were content for the most part, Gail in particular, who was Rose wasn't that involved in the business in any sort of day-to-day basis, but Gail was much more willing to let the management manage the business, except in certain circumstances. So she and Paul David worked together to get rid of one president and replace him with another. So they were involved at that level, but they were much more interested, or Gail was certainly, in the wealth that had been created and protecting that wealth for the family. And so it was
Right.
that was her goal, I think.
But Stephen, don't you think that's a different goal than running the business? Because they could have sold that business right then to private equity for lots of money, and
No,
the family would be set up for generations and generations and generations. And
I think
I continue to struggle with why she would care about this part, about actually running. And I understand you want to be connected to your family roots, and it is a family business. So I'm not dismissing that. It's just a different thing. And if it causes so much pain and trouble within the family, you would think that generation could just move on and take the wealth. That's what I struggle with.
Right, and that ultimately, obviously, is what they did by selling out to Fairfax. They're a much smaller part of Fairfax than they were in the ownership of Cara, but in doing so, they protected their wealth. Right, so the wealth side of it has been protected. I think that what happened in this family, and probably what happens in many family-owned businesses, is that it's really hard to separate out business and family. And the complication for people in the family is, when conflicts begin, they're exacerbated just because they're in family. You can't walk away from your brother or your sister and go on to the next business in the normal sort of way of doing things. So, it becomes a thing that is inexplicably sort of intertwined, the business and the family. And in that process, so if you have troubles in the family, and troubles in the family is really what this is about, not so much in the business, troubles in the family, then it just gets worse, and people then can no longer sort of back away. They can't just walk away from things. They have to fight it out. And that was what was happening, within the Phelan family.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Although there was lots of instances of trouble in the business throughout your book. And for example, they had squeezed margins from, I believe, TWA as a customer demanding a bunch of services on the in-flight services. You had exploding interest rates. When was that? The 80s?
Well, a couple of times, 80s were one of them, and then later
yeah. And so it seemed to me that they had tremendous business leadership, both from within the family and their external management team, at the time to deal through those crises. And I talk to my audience a lot about this as well, that every company needs the right leader for the right time, and companies, all businesses, to go through cycle. We talk about the example of a lot of modern business people don't know that Apple avoided bankruptcy by getting an investment from Microsoft at one
Hmm.
point.
Right.
Right? Bill Gates funded Steve Jobs back in the day, and every company needs leadership that is right for the time. And I think Cara had that from a business perspective, yet a shocking lack of leadership on dealing with the succession
Right.
and the family. There's one quote in your book that I think sums it up. I'm not sure where the quote was from, but it says, too many years of cozy sounding but purposely wounding correspondence between and among PJ and his son and daughter, endlessly upbeat but equally endlessly inconclusive individual and family conclaves with David Bork about how to guide their family and their family business through its next glorious generation. Various, on the one hand, this, on the other hand, that, consultants' reports that PJ had commissioned on succession options, followed by the inevitable counter responses to them, followed by nothing of substance. Disinheriting provisions in PJ's new "you won't like this, Will," that had been teased out elliptically instead of simply explained, and coming together of Gail and her sisters and their reluctant decision to give up trying to fix their family and demanding corporate divorce instead. I mean, that's just a big lack of family leadership, is how that reads to me.
I think that I would not want to disagree with any of that in terms of what was happening. That it was a total lack of leadership, and I think that comes back to Paul James, right? I mean, he is the patriarch. He needed to have a vision and to make decisions around it. He couldn't do that, and worse, he created the conditions for the brother and sister to go at each other, and it was not a who is going to win this, because he never let either of them win it, right? I mean,
Yeah, great point. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the older I get and the more time I spend in business and working with private companies and even family controlled public companies, the more I've learned to understand that you can't separate the business from the people.
Right.
And that's exactly what's going on here. You've got a leader of this business who has serious substance abuse issues. You have kids, some of them are disinterested, and all of them are entitled and feel like they have a say in everything. Yet they have a serious, legit concern about protecting family wealth and not wanting that to fade away. And clearly the patriarch is taking money and spending it on lots of interesting, fun things. So it's a great human story, more than business lessons, I think. But to me, you can't separate the two.
I think that's true. I mean, but I guess people want to look at that book and say, what specific lessons are learned, and I think that probably it's not so much the specific lessons that are learned; it's the larger lesson that you have to deal with succession as an entrepreneur in a family-owned business. You have to think about that. You have to make decisions, and you have to follow through and do it in such a way that you are taking care of your kids. I mean, that's part of all of this, but you're also allowing kids. If you actually go in terms of the book, the last generation to be significantly involved in the business, either the business itself or the holding company, was the generation that they were part of, the fourth generation. The fifth generation, there's only one family member who's still involved in the company in any way. And he's a really interesting story. Sean Regan, who is the son of Gail, he was caught up in the entitlement that you're talking about, having problems with alcohol and other things in his early 20s. And his father suggested that he contact David Bork, and David Bork sort of found him a place in a rehab facility.
Really?
He was there for a month, and at the end of the month, the counselors at the rehabilitation facility said to him, "Don't ever go back to your family." and he didn't. He went to Montreal first, and then he went to British Columbia. And he became a helicopter pilot, and then he got the urge to get back involved in the business. The business was still part of who he was, and so, without telling his mother or anyone else in the family, he applied for a position. And of course, because his name was Regan, it wasn't as clear that he was a Phelan, right? I mean, he was on his own. He went through the second interview and was about to be hired and said, "Okay, I better tell you this." And the guy laughed. Gabe, who was the president at the time, said, "You got here without your family. Come in. I want you to be in the business." He was there all the way through as a corporate executive at Cara, and eventually rose to, I think he was the head of IT or something like that, and then became chair of the family holding company. And in 2015, he was the one who negotiated the deal with Fairfax to sell a company and right. to make changes that made Fairfax interested in the company. So it was a one person, but there's nobody left after that. And I think that it's interesting to me that Rose and Gail and Rose in particular had never had any interest in having her children be part of the company because it was so hurtful. It was such a painful experience to have gone through. Yeah. She was much more, she's obviously happy to have the wealth, but what she wanted to do was give her children the opportunity to do what they wanted to do rather than to be sucked into being part of a company that for much of the time that they were growing up and adults was a kind of a poisoned atmosphere, right?
Right.
Why would you want to go there?
What surprised you the most in this process?
I think everything surprised me. I watched Succession as and enjoyed it as a viewer because it was so interesting. I didn't expect to see that play out before me. One of the things that surprised me was how personal all of this got, and how dysfunctional the family itself was. Because I just give you a couple of examples. Rose went off to school in the United States, and when she would come home, her parents would never be there to greet her. They would be out doing whatever it was that was their thing. She would be picked up by the chauffeur, brought back, and the nanny would provide her with a nice meal for, a homecoming meal. But that was the extent of it. And Helen, who is Paul James's wife, and you mentioned the sort of the Gardner family and Scott's hospitality and all of that sort of stuff, very rich in her own. She and her husband were very competitive. They were a team, but they were also very competitive. And because Helen was involved in boards, both corporate and college hospital boards and all of that sort of stuff, she was considered at the time, this is in the 90s, as a sort of a feminist who was a role model for many young women, but not her kids. She still saw the son as the rightful successor. And if you go back far enough, there's a terrible story, but I'll share it with your audience because it illuminates the dysfunction of the family. Was that when Gail was 4 years old, her mother told her, "You're the reason that little Philip didn't survive." And little Philip was the son after Gail, who was sort of the cord wrapped around his neck. And she told her daughter that she didn't walk early enough, so therefore Helen had to bend over to pick up her daughter all the time. That was why the cord had wrapped around this little boy's neck, and that's why he was never born. And if you look at that, you can see a lot of the dysfunction in that family that came from that kind of situation. The kids were all raised by nannies and cooks and other people like that. So yeah, it was not a good situation.
Sorry.
Yeah, for sure.
This question is not about your book.
Okay.
but I would be remiss in not picking your brain on this particular topic. My audience would be unhappy with me. We live in a business world, Stephen, where we need to turn everything that we're talking about when we're selling, pitching, creating decks. We need to turn all of that into a narrative, into a story. And you teach creative nonfiction program at university. What tips would you give to somebody who is typically actual driven, leading with the what and not the why? Where do you start to make something interesting? I mean, this book is a lot of facts and a lot of research, yet you've turned it into a story. Is there a framework that someone would start thinking about to do that?
I really,
Is that even?
yeah, I mean, I think it is what you just said, which is stories. We live by stories. That's what helps us get by in the world. And I think too often businesses think in factual bits and things that are not about the story. So if you have a business, it is the story of your business, the story of the people who make your business successful, that will connect not only with investors and other people, but your customers, right? If it's genuine, I mean, I think you have to.
Yeah.
You can't have a narrative that is phony and fake, but and sometimes they're not as pretty when they're when all the complications are there. But some of those complications make us all feel a little more human, right? The problems that people have.
Yeah.
So I think that it is thinking of your business in terms of stories, real stories, stories of the founders, the stories of people in your business and how they relate to your customers. All of that sort of stuff, I think, really helps me as a consumer to believe in what you're doing and to want to be supportive, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thank you for that. Future projects. What are you working on next?
I'm writing a novel. I've written some novels
Okay.
before, but this is a World War II detective story. So it's a pleasant change from business, to say the
All
least.
right. All right. So the book is available everywhere now. The Phelan Feud. There is a picture of it, and once again, for those of you on the audio, it is the Phelan Phelan Feud, written by Stephen, spelled with a PH, Kimber, Kimber. Go pick it up. It's a great read. Anything else, Stephen? Did I miss anything?
No, I think not at all. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening. Join us, whenever I do the next podcast. We get some financial literacy series every week, so you can join us for that. Subscribe on whatever you're listening to this on. And once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Take care.